In this video, I'll walk you through the full ancient method mountain villagers used to preserve meat for months without refrigeration. We'll look at why preservation was necessary, how the meat was prepared, how salt protected it, how smoke drying worked, how sun drying was used in high altitudes, and finally, the traditional ways they stored the meat for winter. So let's begin. Mountain life demanded preparation. When winter approached, everything changed. Rivers froze, trails became unreachable, hunting became nearly impossible, and for many families, the only meat available was what they prepared during the short window of autumn. In these remote landscapes, winter was not a simple season. It was an isolating force, a quiet, white world that could last 5 or 6 months. Snow piled up so high that doorways were carved through it. People gathered indoors long before the first snowflake fell, knowing the world outside would soon shut them in. Food, therefore, wasn't convenience. It was strategy. It was survival. Without preservation, food would spoil in days. But with the right technique, it could last for months, even an entire year. Across these mountain regions, from Europe to Asia, the methods were nearly identical. Not because these cultures copied one another, but because nature teaches the same lessons everywhere. Remove the moisture, control the bacteria, protect the meat. These principles became the foundation of ancient preservation, a system shaped not by science textbooks, but by survival itself. In many villages, the arrival of autumn meant long days of preparation. Families worked together, grandparents, parents, and children, because the winter was unforgiving and every pair of hands mattered. Fires burned constantly, tools were sharpened, and the sight of meat hanging or drying outdoors became a symbol of readiness. Preservation wasn't just a technique, it was a ritual of resilience. Now let's take a closer look at how the meat is prepared. Preparation always began at the wooden table, the heart of every mountain home. Families cut the meat into long, even strips. Too thick, and the drying would fail. Too thin, and it would become brittle. The process was slow, rhythmic, almost ritualistic. They worked with tools made of stone or iron, cutting boards made from old trees. Every action was intentional. Each region had its own traditions. In colder climates, they left a thin layer of fat for protection. In warmer areas, they removed it entirely. These choices were shaped by generations of observation. And even without modern sanitizing tools, villagers understood cleanliness. They washed their hands in cold spring water. They wiped tools with cloths soaked in herbs. They opened windows to let in clean, dry air. Before long, the wooden table would be filled with neatly cut strips, ready for the next step. With the meat ready, it's time for the ingredient that makes preservation possible. Salt was the magic ingredient, and in many places, the most valuable one. Coarse, unrefined, and harvested from mountain springs or distant markets, salt was worth more than spices or sugar. When applied to fresh meat, salt draws out moisture. This ancient principle, osmosis, was understood long before science gave it a name. Villagers covered every surface of the meat, pressing the salt firmly into the fibers. This wasn't seasoning, it was protection. The meat then rested, sometimes for a day, sometimes for 3, inside wooden troughs or clay pots. During this time, mountain herbs like thyme, sage, bay leaves, or wild pepper might be added. These were not for taste, they were for protection. Salt didn't just preserve the meat, it bought time, and time was survival. The next step is simple, but incredibly powerful. After salting, the meat was ready for drying. And in the mountains, nothing was more reliable than fire. Smoke drying was the most common method, not because it added flavor, but because smoke is a natural antibiotic. It carries compounds that fight bacteria, fungi, and insects. Inside traditional wooden houses, a small fire burned almost constantly. Families used hardwoods, oak, beech, ash, or mulberry, because these woods created clean, steady smoke. The fire was always kept low. Too much heat would cook the meat. Too little heat would leave it wet and unsafe. So the family watched it carefully, hour after hour, day after day. This slow drying could last several days, but once complete, the meat became firm, protected, and incredibly durable. This wasn't just food, it was a winter lifeline. And for some families, the sun did all the work. In some mountain regions, smoke wasn't necessary. The sun itself became the preservative. High altitudes provide something rare: strong sunlight, low humidity, and clean, freezing winds. These conditions worked together like a natural drying chamber. Villagers hung the meat outside on wooden racks. They used airflow as their greatest tool. To protect the meat, they added natural mesh, herbs, smoke signals, or high platforms to keep animals away. The wind whistled through the drying racks. The sunlight warmed the surface. Days later, the meat transformed, becoming pastirma, basturma, charki, sujuk, or other regional dried meats. Sun drying might look simple, but it required skill. Villagers knew when to bring the meat inside. They understood which days were too warm or too humid. They could smell when the drying was complete. What began as fresh meat became a preserved food with incredible shelf life. So the final step is storage. And the options are fascinating. Let's start with one of the oldest and simplest methods. One method used clay pots. Villagers packed dried meat into the pot and poured melted fat over the top. When the fat solidified, it created an airtight seal. Some pots stayed sealed for months, some for an entire year. The next approach might surprise you, but it worked perfectly for generations. Another method used ash, clean, fine ash from hardwood fires. Ash prevents bacteria, insects, and moisture. Inside these boxes, meat could last for months. Ash acted like a natural refrigerator, but storage didn't stop there. Some villages used the earth itself. In colder climates, underground cellars provided stable temperatures. These stone chambers protected food from freezing temperatures above. Food stored in these spaces stayed cool but never froze, the perfect environment for dried meat. And finally, some families trusted the smoke loft above the fire. Dried meat hung high inside the chimney or smoke loft, where constant smoke kept it safe all winter. And with all these techniques combined, the preservation system becomes complete. This ancient method, cutting, salting, drying, and storing, wasn't complicated. It didn't require electricity or machines. Only patience, observation, and trust in nature. For generations, these skills allowed mountain families to survive some of the harshest climates on Earth. And even today, in remote villages, you can still see dried meat hanging in kitchens, clay pots sealed with fat, and cellars filled with food prepared long before winter arrived. A reminder that the wisdom of the past is not gone. It's simply waiting for us to notice it again. Thank you for watching. I truly appreciate you being here. I'm grateful you were with me, and until next time.